Hello again, everyone. What I'd like to do now is talk about some stuff related to grammar. So throughout these 4 weeks of our class, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different grammar stuff. I know this is probably not your favorite subject, so we're just going to do grammar in little bursts. But grammar is really important because you have to understand the rules in order to make your writing stronger. So ultimately, the goal is you learn all this grammar stuff so that eventually you get to the point where you don't even have to think about it, where your writing just kind of follows these rules automatically. And it also makes you a stronger writer so that later on you can bend some of those rules. So that's why it's really important that we talk about grammar in this class. Today, we're going to cover some grammar basics. We're going to go over some terms that you may already know. Some of it might be new, but we want to make sure that we all have the same vocabulary because we're going to build on these words. We'll be using these words, these terms, as we go on and talk about more complicated grammar stuff in the next couple weeks. Now, as you watch this video, you should have downloaded the worksheet that corresponds with it. So the worksheet has questions to check your understanding as we go through these things. You're going to submit that worksheet so I can look at it and make sure that you're on the right track. We're going to have a quiz on these grammar basics, the kind of topics that we're talking about today, on Monday. So you want to make sure that you submit that worksheet and you get some feedback so you know that you're on the right track with these kinds of things, okay? So I'm going to get out of the way, and I know this is real fancy, but it's just a simple Word document. This is exactly what I do in my face-to-face classes. We're just going to review some of these things. We'll talk about it, and then, of course, if you have questions, you can always email me. So we're going to talk about 5 things today. First, we're going to review what is a subject, a verb, and an object. We're going to talk about number 2, the difference between a phrase and a clause. Number 3, we're going to talk about the difference between an independent and a dependent clause. Number 4, we're going to talk about coordinating conjunctions, what those are. And 5, subordinating conjunctions, what those are and why we need them. So those are the 5 topics under grammar basics for today. So let's start with number 1. So yes, I know you have heard these words over and over again, but it's always good to have a quick review. What do we mean when we say a subject and a verb and an object when we're talking about grammar? So let's look at a couple sample sentences here. Let's start with Jamarcus loves you. Very simple sentence. Now I need to figure out what's the subject, what's the verb, and what's the object here. So let's talk about the subject first. The subject is the person or thing doing an action in a sentence. In this case, my subject is Jamarcus. He, in this case, is the person who's doing something. Now, what is he doing? That's my verb. So in this sentence, we are saying Jamarcus loves something. So loves will be my verb. That's the action that Jamarcus is doing. And then the object, this is, in this case, the person who is being loved, or the person or thing who is being acted upon. That's the definition of an object. So in this sentence, the object is you. So Jamarcus, he's doing the action, he's my subject. Loves, that's the action that he is doing, loving someone, so that's my verb. And then you, in the sentence, is my object. That's the person who is receiving that love. Now let's look at a second sentence. I wanted to sleep in this morning. So, subject, who or what is doing an action? Well, you could probably figure out that the subject in this sentence is the speaker, the I. So, what is that speaker doing? What is the I doing? Well, the I is wanting something. So in this sentence, wanted is my verb. That's the action. And what does this speaker, the I, want? Well, they wanted to sleep in this morning. So this part of the sentence, just broadly, is what we would call the object, okay? So make sure you understand the difference between a subject, the person or thing doing an action, a verb, which is the main action itself, and then the object, the person or thing who receives that action. All right, so that was number 1, subject, verb, object. Number 2, let's talk about this, the difference between a phrase and a clause. Does anybody know? Maybe you've heard this before. So the difference between a phrase and a clause, I will type this up here. A phrase phrase contains either a subject or a verb, but not both. Okay, so let that sink in for a minute. A phrase contains either a subject or an object, a subject or a verb, but not both. So maybe you can guess what a clause does. A clause contains both a subject and a verb. Okay, so that's the difference. A phrase contains either a subject or a verb, but not both, and therefore, of course, a phrase cannot be a complete sentence. A clause contains both a subject and a verb. Okay, does that make sense? If you have questions, you can always email me. So let's look at two examples. Let's look at the example of, let's start with a clause. Let's do that. An example of a clause. I was waiting in line at the drive-thru. So this is a clause because I have a subject, the I who was doing something, and I have my verb, I was waiting. And then of course I have my object, the rest of the sentence, I was waiting in line at the drive-thru. So I have a subject and a verb. So this is an example of my clause, okay? Now let's look at kind of a similar sentence, but we'll look at one that is just a phrase. So therefore it's an incomplete sentence. So a phrase, there we go. So if I look at this, waiting in line at the drive-thru, I have a verb, okay, that's cool, but where's my subject? I don't have a subject identified here. So what I would have to do if I put this in a paper in order for it to make sense, I would have to attach it to a clause that contained a subject and a verb. Just there by itself, it's a phrase. Can't stand alone. It's not a sentence, right? But we can combine clauses and phrases together to make more sophisticated sentences. That's why it's important to know the difference between those two things, okay? So pause for a minute, make sure you understand that difference between a phrase and a clause, and realize the reason we want to talk about them is because by putting them together, that helps us create sophisticated sentences. Okay, going on to number 3, independent and dependent clauses. So first, let's start with this. What is the difference between an independent and a dependent clause? Just remember this. An independent clause can stand alone as a complete thought. It's cool. It can hang up by itself. That's an independent clause. It pays its own bills. It has its own house. Can stand alone. Okay, let me give you an example. Okay, there's an example right there. I still wasn't hungry. Complete thought. I have a subject, I have a verb, it makes sense. That is an independent clause. That is the basic unit of a sentence, okay? Now, let's talk about a dependent clause. You can probably guess, if you didn't already know, a dependent clause cannot stand alone as a complete thought. And I'll give you an example of this too. A dependent clause cannot stand alone as a complete thought. If I said something like this, even though I smelled French fries, love some French fries. This sentence right here, look at it for a second. It has a subject, the I, it has a verb, smelled. What's wrong with it? Well, because I have this phrase, even though, at the beginning, that makes this sentence have to depend on something else to make sense. So it can't stand alone. It's a dependent clause. So when you're looking to see if you have an independent clause or a dependent clause, a clause always has a subject and a verb. You gotta have that, otherwise it's a phrase. But the key is to look for this is what we call a subordinating conjunction. We're gonna get to that in just 1 second, okay? So that's the difference between an independent and a dependent clause. Independent clause can stand alone. A dependent clause cannot. Now let's talk about conjunctions. Conjunctions is how we put different clauses together. So let's start with coordinating conjunctions. What do coordinating conjunctions do? They join two independent clauses together. Now there are 7 conjunctions, and there's an acronym. Maybe some of you know this acronym to remember those 7 coordinating conjunctions. You can remember fanboys. The words for, and, nor, but, or, yet. And so those are my 7 coordinating conjunctions. They can join 2 independent clauses together, okay? So if I said, I still wasn't hungry, but I went anyway, I have 1 independent clause. I have a fanboys coordinating conjunction with the word but, and then a second independent clause. I went anyway. So that's one example of how we can join 2 clauses together. Make some longer sentences, more sophisticated sentences. That's good. We like that. Now, subordinating conjunctions. These are slightly different, same kind of idea, but they join 1 independent clause to a dependent clause. Okay, so these are joining independent and dependent clauses together. Now, there are a ton, and I mean a ton, of subordinating conjunctions. Okay, we only had 7 coordinating conjunctions, but subordinating conjunctions, I mean, there are so many of them. Here are just a couple examples. There are tons. These are some more common ones. Oh, the list just keeps going and going. That's just some examples. Subordinating conjunctions, they basically make one idea less important than another one. So they show kind of a hierarchy of idea. One idea is more important. So here's an example. If I said, even though I smelled French fries, I still didn't want to eat any. Maybe that poor person is sick. I don't know. Who doesn't want to eat French fries when you smell them? But in any case, here is my dependent clause. It starts with my subordinating conjunction, even though I smelled French fries, and I've attached it now to an independent clause. I still didn't want to eat any. So that is how my dependent and independent clauses can work. Okay, let's pause here. Okay, there I am. I'm back. Sorry, guys, I had a weird thing happen with my computer, but here I am back. Okay, so we just talked about subordinating conjunctions. There's a whole bunch of them. These are some examples. Even though is another example of that subordinating conjunction. So subordinating conjunctions join independent clauses to dependent clauses. Okay, so these are some of the grammar basics that we focused on today. We reviewed the difference between a subject, a verb, and an object. We talked about the difference between phrases and clauses. We talked about the difference between independent and dependent clauses. And we talked about coordinating and subordinating conjunctions and how those help us join clauses together. Now, the next grammar topic that we'll be talking about next week looks at some common grammar errors that might happen when we try to join clauses together. So we're going to be building on this knowledge that we just had, that we just gained about clauses and how you put them together when we think about how to be careful of certain mistakes that can happen when we join them. Okay? If you guys have any questions, let me know. Hopefully you're able to answer all those questions on your worksheet. Go ahead and submit those worksheets. I'll take a look at them. If I see any problems or if you're running into any trouble, I will let you know before the quiz on Monday on these grammar basic topics. Okay, thanks everybody. More later.